Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. Hello, I'm Georgina Godwin. Welcome to Read Smart, the official podcast of the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction. This podcast brings together an array of guests from the non-fiction landscape, analysing some of the most crucial themes tackled by writers today. If you enjoy what you hear, please do follow us on your podcast app, share us, or take a moment to write a review. As always, we're immensely grateful to the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its generous sponsorship, which makes this podcast possible. On today's episode, we'll be exploring the incredibly significant subject of mental health within non-fiction, and, more specifically, how writers choose to portray private moments of contemplation on the public literary stage. I'm delighted to be joined today by two authors previously recognised by the prize. Welcome Christina Lamb, one of Britain's leading foreign correspondents, whose book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, gives a voice to women within war, illuminating stories of heroism and resistance from those left fighting for justice. I'm also delighted to be joined by Catrina Davies, author and singer-songwriter. Her book, Homesick, Why I Live in a Shed, tells the story of a personal housing crisis alongside a countrywide one, grappling with class, economics, and the subject of what it means to be truly at home. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Christina, if we could start with you. Our Bodies, Their Battlefield is a brilliantly written portrayal of the collateral damage of conflict and how women are often written out of history. Many reviews have used the words vital and courageous to describe this book. Was there a pivotal moment in your career where you made the decision to write this particular story?
Yeah. I decided to write it because I was angry, I guess. Always, as a foreign correspondent, mostly covering conflict, I've always focused on what happens to women in war, because I think that is a very interesting part that gets neglected. People tend to think war is all about the men fighting on the battlefront. It's usually men and not the rest of it, which is basically how people hold their lives together and keep feeding, educating their children and protecting the elderly as war goes on. To me, that is much more interesting. So I have always spoken a lot to women and tried to tell that story. But there is this dark side of what happens to women in war, which is the use of sexual violence and rape as a weapon of war. And it seemed to me, really, from about 10 years ago, about 2014, that I was just starting to see it more and more. And in particular, that year, you might remember the Chibok girls, who were the girls in North Nigeria who were taken from their school dormitory in the middle of the night, more than 200 of them by Boko Haram fighters. It became the sort of biggest story on earth for about 2 weeks, and then everyone forgot about them. I started traveling around that area and discovered that it was just the tip of the iceberg, that actually thousands of women and young girls had been taken and forced to be so-called bushwives of Boko Haram and were raped, and terrible things happened to them. But around the same time, a few months after that, you had the Yazidi women and girls who, in northern Iraq, a small minority whose area of Shinjar between Iraq and Syria was invaded by fighters from Islamic State who came into their villages, killed a lot of them and elderly, and abducted young women and girls to be sex slaves, and literally had like a market where they took them in what was called Galaxy Cinema, and fighters would come through and touch their breasts, touch their hair, and decide which one they wanted. So when I first heard those stories from some of the Yazidi women who had escaped, and I met them actually on a Greek island when they were fleeing as refugees, I'd never heard such terrible stories in my life. I couldn't believe what they were telling me. So I started writing and interviewing them a lot, but I realized that I was having to write about this happening more and more. You then had the Rohingya people fleeing from Myanmar into Bangladesh. Again, the women had all got terrible stories about being gang raped, tied to banana trees and raped by Burmese soldiers, often in front of their children. And in all of these cases, the women actually did speak about what happened, which is a very brave thing to do. And yet nothing happened. And so the moment that really made me think that I've got to write something more than just the articles I was writing was when one of the young Yazidi women that I had spoken to, actually a 16-year-old, sent me a WhatsApp afterwards, and she said, "We told our story. What difference did it make?" And I just couldn't answer that question, because when I looked at it, actually, you could say it made no difference, because nobody had been brought to justice. They were still living in terrible situations. So I felt very angry and upset about it, and started to really research the subject.
Has anybody been brought to justice? Has it stopped?
No, it hasn't stopped. And in fact, sadly, it's happening in all around the world. When I started really looking at it, there isn't a conflict where it doesn't happen. And sadly, we've seen it quite a lot in recent conflicts. In Ukraine, we've had lots of cases of women raped by the Russians when they occupied areas. Also in Israel and Gaza, on both sides, Hamas fighters, when they carried out their horrendous attack on October the 7th, raped some of the young women at the music festival that they attacked. I've also just come back from the West Bank, and they've been talking to some prisoners who have just been released from Israeli prisons, Palestinian prisoners. They were telling me horrendous stories of sexual abuse that they suffered. I'm afraid that it is happening all over the place. In terms of people being brought to justice, almost nobody. I mean, nobody's been brought to justice for the tens of thousands of women and girls taken in Nigeria. Nobody's been brought to justice for what happened at Rohingya. And in terms of the Yazidis, lots of ISIS fighters have been brought to justice in Iraq, but not for what they did to the Yazidis. They've been charged with terrorism. And in fact, I even went to the trials and asked the Chief Justice if the people he was trying had captured Yazidi girls, and he said yes. And I asked, why is that not in the charges? Why are you not? And he just laughed and said that they also killed and tortured people. Why would we bother? And I'm afraid that that's a lot of the problem, that it's an issue that gets sidelined. And somehow, I would say particularly male judges or negotiators or peacekeepers have a tendency to think that this is somehow not as important an issue, when if you speak to any of the women or girls who went through this, they will almost certainly say that they would rather have died than gone through what they did.
Catrina, I'd like to bring you in now. Your book, Homesick, addresses both a countrywide and a personal issue. That's the housing crisis, which is still haunting the UK. I wonder what inspired you to transform your personal experience into a written account, and what that process was like. Catrina?
I think that I was also inspired by anger to a certain extent, in that I saw the housing crisis as a great injustice, especially where I live in Cornwall, because we have so many empty houses, which are second homes, and so many people who can't find anywhere to live, who've grown up here, who've got their whole families here. I was working in the tourism industry, so I was seeing this up close, and, it was very personal. And also my parents were struggling with housing, and, it felt like such a fundamental thing to a person's capacity to thrive in life. I saw my mum struggle with, she's had very serious mental health issues, and I saw how they were made so much worse by the fact that she was having to move every year or two because the houses were being sold or the rent was going up and she couldn't afford it. Unfortunately, since I wrote the book, the whole thing's got much worse. And I think the process of writing it helped me kind of understand it, but also made me angrier, if anything, because I began to see it more as a symptom of a kind of, I suppose, an example of where the stories that were told about life are at odds with, I think, the kind of reality that we're living. And I think that makes for a kind of mental health crisis, to be honest.
And I mean, your reality was that you lived in a shed for a decade.
Yeah. And it's funny because when the book came out in 2019, so it's actually got much worse. And also my situation's changed a bit. But I was interested that the press at the time really focused on painting me as a victim which was interesting because I think that one of the things I was trying to get across was that I was lucky because I had the option of choosing to live a simple life, which meant that I was free from this kind of coercive, spiraling housing cost trap, if you like. It's true that it had its hardships. It definitely had its hardships, and I wouldn't say that, it's right for everybody. But I think one thing that's really striking at the moment in Britain is that the option to live simply and cheaply just isn't there. Like, you have to be fully kind of paid up and slaving away to just get the very basic necessities of life. And that to me seems like a really big and sad thing, because it leaves no room for personal growth or for art or for anything other than just getting by.
We're recording this podcast on the day where the Prime Minister Keir Starmer's just given a televised address, and he was talking about huge changes to housing policy, that blocks will be stopped, that suddenly there will be a building boom. Do you trust this?
If it was going to be a social housing building boom, then yes, but it isn't, as far as I know. I don't see what the incentive is for private developers to build affordable housing. I just don't see why they will do that. Housing that's actually affordable isn't going to make anybody a profit. I mean, it would actually be very beneficial to councils if they could build their own housing and then rent it out themselves, because they would own the houses and they would get the rent. But as it is, they have to pay housing benefit essentially to private landlords. I don't see why that's going to change just by building more houses. I mean, maybe in some particular areas of the country that will help. Here it won't help because we don't have a lack of housing. We have a lack of affordable housing.
Christina, you cover very intimate and traumatic personal matters within your writing. I wonder what the greatest challenge you encountered has been whilst undertaking this work.
Well, in this particular book, I'm reporting on rape as a weapon of war. Of course, it's an incredibly difficult thing to ask somebody to talk about. You're asking them to talk about something incredibly intimate and the worst day of their lives. And I was very worried about re-traumatizing people by making them go through something that was so terrible. Obviously, it would be the last thing you'd want to do. So the way I did it was every place. I went to 12 different countries to talk to women in different conflicts. And every place I went to, I went through organizations, like legal organizations, where women were trying to get legal redress for what happened to them, or counseling groups. And I asked those people, I told them what I was doing, that I was writing a book, collecting accounts, and asked them if they had anybody who would like to tell their story. Because, some people feel that it's therapeutic, that they actually own their story. And so it's all about really how it's done, I think. And so, and in most of the interviews I did, there was somebody else present, like a counsellor, so they could monitor what the effect that the conversation was having. And I made very clear to everybody I spoke to, the last thing I want to do is make you talk about something you don't want to. And if at any point you feel you want to break or you just don't want to talk about it, that's absolutely fine. And actually only one person, probably interviewed hundreds of people, only one woman after a while said, actually, I really don't want to do this. And that was fine. But everybody else did talk. And after I read the book, it made me think a lot about what we do as journalists, because we're very often the first people to talk to deeply traumatized people who are fleeing the war zone or arriving as refugees. It's us that's on the border, not psychologists or people who know professionally how to deal with them. We're not trained in how to deal with deeply traumatized people. And of course, many of us as journalists are in a hurry. We want the story. We just want the juiciest bits. We don't want to sit for hours listening to everything. So I was quite disturbed by this afterwards, and I then talked quite a lot to some of the survivors, some of the women that I got to know, with also an American filmmaker who'd made a film about people who prosecute sexual violence, who also had the same kind of feeling as me. We ended up kind of drawing up some advice or guidelines for journalists with the survivors of how best to do this. And one of the things they said, well, apart from the fact that the interviews should be where they wanted them to be. They should choose who was there and they should take as long as they wanted. But one of the things that really struck me was that they didn't want to just be regarded as their trauma. They wanted us to talk to them about them as a people before this happened, what their hopes and dreams were, so it's not just about that terrible thing. And also I think it's very important to finish the interview, not just listen to the terrible thing and then, close your notebook or turn the camera off and say, great, thanks, goodbye, but actually, talk to them, try and end the interview on a more positive note. So talk to them about what could be done to try and help them to justice. I always remember going and meeting some of the Yazidi women who had actually been taken to Germany. It was a German state, Baden-Württemberg, that took in around 1,000 of the Yazidi women and girls who'd managed to escape captivity. And so I went to go and meet some of them. And the interviews were really harrowing and difficult. And I was staying quite far from the place where I'd gone to interview them, probably about 3 hours drive. So I went to leave at the end of the day. And then they said, oh no, we've prepared dinner for you. So then I was thinking, I've got this long trip, and also they don't have any money, so it's not really fair to be eating that food. So I was sort of protesting, but they said, no, please, we've done this, please stay. And so I stayed for this dinner, and we just chatted about other things. We talked about what kind of food they make, what kind of food we have in England. And they were very amused that our sort of national dish is some, chicken tikka masala, which is not originally from here. At the end of it, they all hugged me and they said, nobody else has come and talked to us as normal people. They just want our stories and then go. Yeah. And that really stuck with me. And I think it's, really important to not make it just seem such a transactional thing.
Absolutely. I mean, Catrina, you've mentioned on your blog that the important creative link between home and selfhood has become hijacked and monetized by consumerist ideology. That crucial issue of finding home, not just physically, but also within one's own mind, is a fascinating issue. So I wonder what home means to you and if that definition has changed over time.
It's a really good question. I think it's unrealistic to say that home isn't a physical place, like a shelter. I think it's true that home is a lot of different things. And I think family is home. Being at home means more than just being in a particular house, for example. But I do think to feel at home is about feeling safe. And it's about being able to close the door on the world, if you see what I mean. So it's a place for you to be yourself with no outside pressures. And I actually think it's harder and harder because of the internet intruding into our private spaces, that I think it's a real mental health problem that even in our homes, the world is in there kind of reaching for us and trying to get us to do stuff or to be a certain way. I think home is where you just get to be yourself. And I think it starts very small. It starts with a safe space, and then it can kind of widen out into your neighborhood and your wider world, and then perhaps your country or whatever. But I think it starts very small and very personal.
And of course, Christina, the women that you spoke to had generally lost their homes, and certainly their homes were not a safe space for them. I wondered, though, you talked about trying to protect those women and be very careful in the way you spoke to them. What about the effect on your own mental health?
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, my books, as you know, it's difficult to read because the stories are really awful, what happened, and it was difficult to write. And so when I was writing the book, I found I could only really work for a few hours a day on it, and then I had to sort of go outside and remind myself that there were still some beautiful things in the world, in parks and trees, and just try and do other things, meet friends, go to theatre, things that enable me to think about different things, because otherwise I think you could get a bit consumed by the anger and also the trauma of what is happening. But absolutely I felt and feel all the time with what I'm writing is however difficult it might be for me to listen to stories or write them, is nothing compared to the people who are going through these things. And so, I think that's why it was so difficult getting that WhatsApp what difference does it make? Because I can feel, maybe wrongly, perhaps I'm doing something useful, that telling these stories will make a difference, that people will read them or be motivated to do something. But if in fact that doesn't happen, then it does make you really question, why am I putting myself, but also all these people through, if it makes absolutely no difference to them?
I mean, just staying with that idea of healing, Catrina, your book presents Cornwall in a particularly positive light. And I wonder why or how that location provided a sense of belonging and indeed of healing.
Coming back to what I was saying about home, I think it's important, and I think I'm very lucky that I have a connection to this particular landscape that feels very powerful and meaningful to me. And I think one of the things that causes us to look perhaps for significance in objects in like consumer culture is that we perhaps have lost some of that relationship to our kind of that sort of natural space around us. And I think finding that community can be really important, a community among people, but also among creatures and in the natural world. And I've been picking up on what Christina was saying. I think that I suppose being in a world where so many people are refugees, it's easy to take for granted the fact that your home, your place is stable and safe, and to forget that for so many people that's been ripped away from them. And I think that the fact that home, if you have a safe and secure home, whether that's a house or just a safe country, you take it for granted because you should take it for granted in the same way that a toddler should take the parent's love for granted that you don't notice. But when it's taken away or when it becomes fragile and precarious, you really notice because it's so profound.
Yeah. Christina, you've talked a little bit about what impact you'd like your work to have. I wonder what you think about when you contemplate your literary legacy within the space of war correspondence.
I mean, it feels a bit pretentious to talk about my literary legacy, but I don't know. I hope that if I've done anything, I've been a war correspondent for 36 years and written a number of books. To me, this book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefields, was by far my most important book because it was writing about something that hadn't really been written about. It was something people found often uncomfortable to think about, but just because something's uncomfortable doesn't mean we should ignore it. On the contrary, we should do something about it. So it was quite, it sounds odd to say a good thing, but the war in Ukraine, suddenly for the first time, I saw a lot of people reporting on war rape, which had always just not been reported on. So it helped in any way make a small difference in making people see that that was something really important. It is a war crime, and it is the world's most neglected war crime. As I said earlier, really justice, accountability is the exception, not the rule. That, I would feel that was something useful to have done. And also just, often and reporting on has tended to be done by male writers, and books have not talked much about what women did the war. So to try and sort of restore the balance a bit would be something I would feel happy to have achieved.
Catrina, your book is called Homesick. Does that title refer to a feeling of nostalgia within the self or a wanting to go back to the past?
I think it refers to a feeling of being unwell because of home being so unreachable. The deep anxiety and kind of trauma that comes from years of not feeling like you have access to a permanent that you can call your own, that you're not going to be turfed out of at any minute. I mean, I think these days, the term generation rent is very appropriate because I think so many young people just don't have access to a future because they can't build any foundations. They can't make themselves the foundations of a life that can be kind of well lived. I mean, I see my nieces and nephews who are in their early 20s kind of floundering because there's just no pathway to adulthood, if you see what I mean. And I think I also wanted to in the book kind of address the connection between the way that we treat houses as assets instead of homes, and the way that we treat the world as a kind of resource to be exploited as opposed to a home. I think those things, I mean, we perhaps not individually, but I think culturally we have come to live in that way. And I think that one of the ways to repair our kind of relationship with the natural world would be to repair our relationship with home and housing.
That's wonderful. Thank you both so much for taking the time to talk to us today. Just a reminder that Christina Lamb's book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, and also Catrina Davies' book, Homesick, Why I Live in a Shed, are both available now. We'd once again like to thank the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its invaluable support of this podcast. And to find out more about the Baillie Gifford Prize, you can visit the website or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at BG Prize. And if you enjoyed this podcast, do please write a review. Tune in next time to hear more from the world of literary non-fiction. Until then, thanks for listening. Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.